So many of us know that something is wrong with the way our government is functioning, yet we seem overwhelmed by the task of fixing it. Welcome, I'm Barry Kibrick, and my guest, F.H. Buckley, the distinguished professor of George Mason's University School of Law, knows we can make a difference. In part one of our conversation about his book, The Republic of Virtue, we'll see how things went wrong, and then in part two, what we can do to correct them. Frank, it is such a pleasure. I read this and I said, not only are we going to do one episode, we're doing two. Welcome to Between the Lines. This book is deep and beautiful. Thank you.
Barry, thank you so much for having me. Music to my ears.
It's my pleasure. We're going to start with, as the opening chapter, the United States of Corruption.
Yeah.
What this is about is, it's sort of two parts, which is what we're going to discuss. It shows how the framers did their best to get corruption out of government, yet the human quality, it can't escape it, and then how it turned, and then finally what we're going to discuss in our second segment, second taping actually, is what your ideas, my ideas, and what we could really do to turn this around.
Well, the title of the book, The Republic of Virtue, is self-consciously ironic in a way, in the sense that there never is such a thing, and the people who tried to create it, people like Robespierre in France, found that it was necessary to cut off a few heads. So we began with some framers who had a very clear view about fallen humanity, and they didn't think the answer was simply democracy. Rather, they thought the answer was blocking techniques, the separation of powers, things that would prevent any one person from becoming too powerful. That was their view of it.
And they were very well aware of the human foibles of corruption. That's why they thought blocking it was the ultimate way. But I want to make clear, too, what we mean by virtue, because as you said,
Yeah.
Robespierre, when his virtue was, you didn't believe in what I said, off with your head, their virtue is literally more of a republic's virtue. Explain what that is itself, because I found your definition of the republic virtue to be so important.
Yeah. Well, what I'm talking about is Republican virtue as understood by the framers, and it's really very historical. What happened was the framers were steeped in Roman literature about the expulsion of the kings from Rome, and they were fascinated by heroes like Cato or Lucius Junius Brutus, people who expelled the king, and they thought, this is what we need in America. And when they looked at England, what they saw were two things they didn't want. They didn't want a king, and they didn't want British corruption. And they thought, we can do better. We can do it without a king, with a modest president, and we can do it in a way that will banish English-style corruption. So their sense of Republican virtue is very, very different from that of the French, of Robespierre. For Robespierre, it's all about empowering people. The people can't go wrong, right? From the point of view of Washington and Madison and all, no, the people can get it wrong.
And also, there's another little debate that goes on within the debate, and that is the private virtue of a citizen versus the public virtue. Because guys like Ben Franklin may not have been, quote, virtuous as Adams would have liked to have seen someone virtuous, but there is a little difference also between how you behave as a citizen and how you behave as yourself. And there also is a connection somewhat.
Yeah.
So there's a difference and a connection. It's kind of an interesting point.
Yeah, there is a connection, but it was meant to be different. Some of the framers were world-class playboys, and you mentioned Franklin, who, Adams was shocked with in Paris. And then there was this guy, Gouverneur Morris. And what I do in the book is I try to bring out Morris as really one of the guys, maybe the guy more than anybody, who put it all together. Now, Gouverneur Morris, shared a mistress with Talleyrand when he was in France a few years earlier. So private virtue, this is, the name of private virtue is not Gouverneur Morris. So you start with people like Washington, who embody this classical 18th century sense of virtue, and virtue there means disinterested leaders who serve the public interest. And then you have Gouverneur Morris and Benjamin Franklin, who are not quite 18th century figures, they're moderns. Yeah, they're more people like us. And they, we would not call them privately virtuous.
And as you said, the new government that was being formed understood this. Their job, though, to the best of their ability, was how do we keep this, though, out of the body politic? How do we know that men and women could falter. How, though, do we keep it out of the body politic? Like you said, they tried separation of powers. There's lots of efforts, and some of them have unintended consequences.
Right. There's another sense of virtue in the sense of extensive virtue, the virtue of people who look to America. And here's the thing you have to remember about the Constitutional Convention. There wasn't an America during the convention. There was the loosest form of association. It was the convention that made us Americans. We didn't really exist as a country beforehand. That's why it's the most important event in American history. And people like Washington thought, what we have to do is make people think nationally and strengthen the national government. And that was the great battle in Philadelphia in 1787, the states' rights people versus the nationalists.
And they both had great points. That's what was interesting. That's what made that debate so intellectual, because Madison thought, like you write in the book, that, gosh, if we have just that state right, that gives us a weird way, a better chance of corruption, because the states may corrupt each other or do this. Then you had the Jeffersonian who wanted even more of a democratic. Then you had the more of those that felt, the national government, though, we can't make that so big. It's a very interesting mix, and the debates that go on truly draw out the ultimate virtue, at least as the attempt that these framers were going for.
Well, I wrote a screenplay about this, and reading the debates, some of these guys, they seem to be talking to posterity. They were reading speeches, and the speeches were meant for us to read hundreds of years later. And it didn't turn out the way they expected. Nothing ever does. And they had very different ideas about how to do it. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to explain how the people we think made it happen were the people who just got in the way. Madison, for example. Madison, I think, nearly led a walkout on July 17, 1787. And because he was so disgusted about how extremely decentralized it would be. And the guy who prevented that from happening was this very clever fellow, Gouverneur Morris, and he did that on the morning of July 17. And so in the morning, we didn't know if we'd have a walkout in a country, and it was solved a couple of hours later, and that's why July 17, 1787 is the most important date in American history.
Oh, you make that so clear in the book. But what is so, and this is where it begins to turn, and then, as I say, we'll get into the remedies later, but now what we realize is within just a few years, this Republic of Virtue already has its first big fissure and crack, to the point where now, in the book, you state, on one level, we may be the most corrupt. I say that, we know that. Let me rephrase that, because obviously there's so many states way worse and nations way worse. But in comparison to what the dream of virtue this republic was, we've gone a very long way from it.
Some people ask me, you're talking about corruption in America. I don't get it. I mean, I don't see it. And I say, there's this place called Illinois. Have you ever heard of it? That kind of answers that. 4 ex-governors in prison, yeah.
But you say something too interesting about the corruption. The easy corruption, as you even state in the book, the 4 governors in prison, we're able to catch actually the actual corrupt in a very relatively good way. You say the FBI does it all the time, they put them in jail. It's that hidden corruption. Yeah. That's where we have the problem with the backroom deals. It's nothing that's necessarily illegal. In fact, as you say, it may even be ingrained now in the Constitution in a certain way, but yet we know as citizenry that something's wrong in, I was going to say something smells wrong in Denmark, but that's just the opposite. Denmark's doing it pretty well, actually.
Right.
But, something's definitely wrong in the government. There's no doubt about it. Every citizen of every political stripe feels it. So it's an interesting thing that this government of corruption is something that we're aware of, and yet we're struggling so hard, if not harder than the framers at this point, to try to correct it.
I came here from Canada and became a citizen 4 years back. And if you're Canadian, you're always fascinated by the States. And what I feel about the States is there's a lot of Humphrey Bogart and Casablanca in every American. There's a sense that, we're cynical. But deep down, we find that hard to live with. America is a country of loud ebullience, but quiet nobility. And so if we are corrupt, that rubs us the wrong way. We're not like the French, I think, who could say, okay, of course, corruption, yes. No, we react against it. And sometimes we don't react well. Sometimes we make things worse, but we find it hard to accept.
I want to quote your words, though, and I think this is interesting. The desire to please others civilizes us, but taken to the extreme, it may smile at corruption. That's when I saw that, I put it in bold, because what an interesting dichotomy that is. When you sit there and because there is almost nothing higher than you can do than to, please others, or at least attempt to, but yet so show us that dichotomy and how that really gets to the heart and soul of this.
I talked about Tocqueville, and Tocqueville, some people think Tocqueville liked America. I'm not so sure. Tocqueville had a problem with American individualism, but then he said there's a cure for it, because since it's a very free country, people have to form associations, and that's good. But the forming of associations involves exactly that desire to please, and so one finds fewer eccentrics here than one would say in British politics. I mean, there's a desire for conformity here, which seems strong to me, coming here from another country.
Interesting. Conformity here, because that's something that I don't think Americans themselves feel as much as, well, in fact, de Tocqueville said it too. He didn't think we even realized it to a certain extent. But those non-governmental organizations, and you mentioned such as the PTA or the people that pick, in a sense, that also holds one of the potential saving graces for the country, because if these if in some way we don't need the government to do everything for us, there is more of the citizenry feeling empowered.
Yeah, no, that is, it's a two-edged sword, and the older I get, everything seems to be a two-edged sword.
Oh, isn't that something? Well, perfect. Can I give you another example from your book even? We see the mote in the eye of an enemy while ignoring the beam in a friend's eye. Talk about a double-edged sword right there.
Well, if you wanted to explain corruption in America right now, I think the extreme ideological split would have something to do with it. In other words, we're going to vote for our guy, and we don't care. And the other side will feel the same way. And in a way, it's like Edwin Edwards running against a David Duke from the Klan back 10 years back. And the slogans were, vote for the lizard, not for the wizard, right? And and that makes sense, right? So there are worse things than corruption. There's pure evil. Corruption ain't good, but then there's real evil.
And I think the evil comes from your words when you said about Pascal, who wrote that men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they believe they are following their conscience. And I can't help but notice that all the time. I have a little joke with my family, and I go, be careful of the do-gooders. Not the people who do good, but the do-gooders. They want to clear their conscience that they're doing the right thing. And sometimes even if it's unintended, the most evil may be the wrong word, but the most despicable. I don't know what's less than evil, but not so much. Acts become out of that when they're so much feeling that their conscience is soothed.
Well, this is why I like the framers. I'm a Pascalian.
I thought you were a rapscallion, but go ahead.
Well, that too. And so when the framers talked about, look, we're fallen humanity, the crucial thing is not to depend on the private virtue of people, but create a structure of government that'll stop the problem. And that's why I think at every moment in that convention, when they were at full stop, it was the fear of corruption and the way of responding to corruption that brought them together. So that's really how it worked. I mean, they were ready to break up until July 17, and thereafter it's one debate after the other about what we do about corruption. And their argument was we can't rely on individuals, but we'll create a structure of government. And so the Constitution looks like, to me, an anti-corruption covenant.
Didn't you even, I don't want to spend the time trying to find your exact words, but I'll state it, and I know what you'll catch on and you'll fill it in. About Socrates, if they said, in Greeks, when they became this notion of a democratic republic, they said, even if every man was a Socrates, give me the exact quote. Do you know it offhand?
Well, the exact quote is from Madison, and if everyone was Socrates, you would still need a government that restrained
the mob of Socrates, right? That's what it was.
Yeah.
So what we see, though, now is now let's bring it to our time. And what we see now, as you say, the growing concern, these are your words, that the federal government has become a necessary business partner, and that the imagined but not entirely imaginary free market capitalism of the past has been transformed into this wasteful crony capitalism. And that's where both now the system of government, the system of economics, they are now both corrupted to a very large extent, in fact.
And there are things we can do about it, which I suggest in the book, if we focus on crony capitalism and K Street lobbyists and the like. And many of our rules, which on campaign finance and the like, are entirely misguided, because they're aimed at chilling the voices of ordinary people. But the ordinary people, these are not the people on K Street. So there's a lot of naivete about how laws get made. I mean, some people think, right, well, we'll have this great idea and it's going to happen. But when it does, it'll be the fingers of the lobbyists who weigh heavily on the scale.
Well, that's why your words again, complexity in government really gives the advantage to the large firms that can afford it. The small business who they're always touting, the small business, they can't really get around all of these regulations. You gave an example. I don't even want to mention the company's name, if that's okay.
Sure.
But they are a top 10 Fortune 500 company, maybe one or two. I'll give them a big hint, okay? And they didn't even pay taxes one year.
Right.
And yet they lobbied so hard for tax reform. So it's sort of like, not only do they hold all the cards, but they even have the joker as well.
Yeah. The sad thing is, investing in government is something every large firm has to do. I mean, Bill Gates, I guess, at one point thought he was bigger than Washington. And he got taken down when Microsoft was nearly split in two. And now Microsoft is one of the biggest lobbying operations in the District of Columbia. So that's why it's been said of D.C. that we've grown the largest network of patronage and influence of any country at any time in world history.
Now, you use this term that I have not heard of before, but yet seems central to this situation and problem. And as I said, we'll get to the solutions in our next episode. Minoritarian misbehavior.
Yeah.
The framers even saw this. You mentioned Madison saw this. Explain what that actually is, because I've got 3 or 4 paragraphs I could read, but I think if you just let us know what that is, because it's a term I've not heard, and I doubt if the viewers are that familiar with it.
Well, the idea is that the presidential system that we have is not ideally suited to curb corruption as opposed to, say, a parliamentary system. And one problem is the checks and balances. So we don't have, for example, a unified political party as they do in other parliamentary countries. We have the National Republican Party, and we have the Ohio Republican Party, and we have whatever was in John McCain's head this morning. And they're all independent, and they don't have to, get along necessarily with the president. That's, of course, true in both parties. And what happens afterwards is the deal making, which produces special benefits for one state. It's not the kind of corruption where you put money in your pockets. That's the worst kind. But another kind of corruption is the sweetheart deals for one state versus another, which is what you needed, for example, to get Obamacare passed. And that can be seen as a form of corruption. In any event, it is a problem.
Well, because again, if we go back to that definition of Republican virtue, and that's small r, it's not the party Republican
right, yeah.
Party, the virtue of the Republic, what you see is that those are the first people who are dropping the interest of the country and going for their own self-interest. Yet, what almost works best, as you say, is go for yourself. In fact, this is what the founders also felt. There's no doubt that they had this bourgeois attitude.
Yeah.
We're going to be selfish. That's okay. Be selfish. Go for as much as you can go, but not at the expense of the public good. It's sort of like the Henry Ford method of, let's make everyone be able to afford the car, not just show
right.
the disparity in wealth between me and everyone else. That's another big problem when you have this massive disparity in wealth and that lowering of that middle class. You don't see them almost anymore.
What Washington had in mind in terms of virtue was people who thought in terms of the country as a whole. And as I say, the country didn't really even exist at that point. But when somebody says, look, I want this little kickback for my state of Nebraska, that's what you need to do for my vote, that's entirely inconsistent with what Washington wanted, and that I described as the behavior of a minority that is one state as opposed to the nation as a whole.
Here's my big problem when you have a true ultimate democracy and a popular vote and people writing their own bills like they do in California and get them into initiatives. You have no one to blame but yourself.
Yeah.
And that's a very dangerous situation. If you have no one to blame but yourself and you don't want, then what do? So the Republican and Democratic process allows you to, what Madison hoped would filter up the good people, and then if they made mistakes, you can vote the bums out.
Right.
Not as easy necessarily as in a parliamentary system,
right.
but still could be done. And now even that seems to be almost impossible to do.
Well, it's called responsible government. I mean, the growth of democracy in a parliamentary country was a government is responsible to the people. Now, as we talk, we're confronting the possibility of a government shutdown. And who's going to be to blame? Some people will say, Republicans will say it's the Democrats, Chuck Schumer, Democrats will say it's Trump. There'll be a lot of finger pointing. But it's going to be hard to assign blame. Whereas if you're a unified government in a parliamentary system, you're on the hook. There's a problem, you're supposed to cure it, right?
But yet at the same time, we, even in your solutions, which we're going to talk about, as I said in our next episode, in a sense from Canada, I know you'd love to see that parliamentary system come in, but that's...
I'm not a fool.
Am I right? That's not going to happen.
No.
So we've got to think of something
right.
a little bit differently, don't we?
Exactly right. If we wanted a parliamentary system, we're 230 years too late.
Yeah, it seems that, it really does
Yeah.
seem that way.
And at the time, nobody knew what the 19th century would bring in terms of what parliamentary government would look like. At the time, corruption was the King of England, George III, basically bribing MPs and, exerting power through Parliament that way. What happened in the 19th century was the all-powerful House of Commons, right, which is the exact opposite of a separation of powers. And so that raises the question, what is better, an all-powerful branch or a divided government, right?
The debate continues, and we will continue. I want to end this episode with your words. We shaped our institutions and then our institutions shaped us. Frank, in part 2 of our conversation, as I said, will explore ways of shape-shifting. And
Okay.
I thank you very much for joining us
Good stuff.
today.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you all for joining us. Now, before Mr. Buckley leaves, I'd like to leave you with these few more words from the Republic of Virtue. The United States may be one of the richest countries in the world, but we still pay a price for corruption. If we could somehow make the country more honest, we'd want to do so. And if the cost of corruption is as high as it appears, we should make it one of our chief goals. I'm Barry Kibrick. Between the price of corruption and the highest of virtues is the sweet spot where our country needs to be. And in part 2 of my conversation with Frank F.H. Buckley, we'll see how we can get there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
To connect with Barry, like him on Facebook and follow him on Twitter at Barry Kibrick. And to contact Barry directly, view past episodes of Between the Lines, and read his weekly blog, visit us at barrykibrick.com.